Dr. Gish and the creationists also appeal to what in the trade we call typological thinking. Typological thinking is saying this thing is a cat. He flashes a picture of a skull on and says this thing is human, this thing isn't human. The most important thing about the theory of evolution in the middle part of this century, when Darwin's notions of evolution were combined with Mendel's notions of genetics, is that we see the enormous amount of variation within things. That is, the picture that we have of the world at the moment, of consisting of cats and dogs and lions and zebras and dandelions, is that set of animals that are present in the world at this moment. But in fact, we have, even in our lifetime, seen many cases of organisms evolving or populations evolving into new species. And in fact, one of the most active research projects going on in Guy Bush's lab at Michigan State is to be able to follow the change in genes within organisms leading to the formation of new species. This is a very difficult and subtle task, but let me suggest just one thing to you. Evolutionists, particularly paleontologists, now recognize that of all of the species that have ever lived, probably 99% have gone to extinction. And when you go back into the fossil record, and I again recommend Bierbauer's book or Kummel's book on this, you will see that the books are crammed with species, crammed with organisms that don't look anything at all like the organisms that we see today. That is to say that the organisms that are present in the world as we find it today are, if you will, groups of different species of organisms which have a past and which presumably have a future. I would have to say realistically, little as I like it, that if we are like all the other species on this planet, odds are pretty good that we will go to extinction as well. I hope it's not for a while, because I have some plans to play golf. Still, to talk about cats being cats is to, how am I going to put this to you, is to give you a conclusion, not a question. I would regard the cats as I find them today as being intermediate forms between their feline ancestors and their unimaginable descendants. And I would hold that to be true for every species on this planet. And I would also say that if somehow I were given a time machine and allowed to go back, for example, to the early Cambrian and look at the evolution of life there, I would come to exactly the same conclusion. I would name things, and I would say, I don't even know what names these things have. They're all things with funny shells and so forth. But this is of this and this is of this. And in the early Cambrian, I would have made exactly the same argument that Duane Gish is making in 1987. I think it's a fallacious argument.
Less than 2 minutes.
The theory of evolution simply says that all life is in constant flux and that populations change over time. What we mean by evolution is, in fact, the change in populations of plants and animals over time. I think that any other way of representing this, in fact, trivializes the nature of evolutionary theory as we understand it today. It is complex, I don't deny that, but you can educate yourself on it by reading some of these books, by understanding the assumptions that science makes and understanding the ways in which they interpret evidence, and I would strongly urge you to do so. Thank you.
Dr. Gish, your final 5-minute rebuttal, please.
Now, what does evolution say? What does the theory really say? What the theory says is not that we're just in flux and variation and so forth. Evolution theory says we started with a little microscopic organism several billion years ago, and that organism has evolved or changed into all living organisms today. That's what evolution means. It means change from one animal to another and one plant to another. And all of us, you and I, from that little microscopic organism through accidental genetic mistakes. That's what evolution says. Let's don't trivialize this theory. That's what it means. Now, Dr. Weinshank says we don't publish in reputable journals. Let me tell you a little incident that happened not long ago. I was talking to one of the editors of Discover, one of these quasi-scientific journals, and I asked her, I said, if I wrote an article defending creation against evolution. Would you publish it? She says, no, we won't. Then they turn around and say, see, you don't publish in our journals. Of course we don't publish in their journals. They will exclude it. They will not publish them. If I would publish an article challenging the validity of evolution theory, I tell you it would never see the light of day in one of those journals. Sir Fred Hoyle was asked, why have you published this material about your ideas on the origin of life in a book? Why didn't you publish it in the standard journal? He said they wouldn't publish it if I offered it to them. That's why. Of course, they exclude us. They censor us. Talk about book burners and censorship. That's what we have today. They're trying to keep us out of the public schools. I'm not saying Dr. Weinshank is doing that, but most evolutionists don't want our case to be heard in the public schools and to have the students hear that and read that in their textbooks, in their journals, because now they have a stranglehold on education. They don't want to face a scientific challenge.
2 minutes.
Now, about these gaps in the fossil record, I want to emphasize again, we can talk about horses, and we could talk about horses. I could certainly talk about them. There are no transitional forms between those species. I've got a quote here right from an evolutionist who said that. But that's silly to argue about that. Here are gaps between the microscopic organism and those invertebrates that beyond dispute. You didn't hear Dr. Gish-Weinshank question that big, huge gap. You didn't hear him question the fact about the gap between invertebrates and fishes. You didn't hear him present any transitional form between invertebrates and fishes. Of course he didn't. Of course he couldn't. And that settles it, ladies and gentlemen. I'm not going to be dragged into a dispute about these things because it's already been settled. The gaps are so immense and so indisputable, it establishes that evolution has not occurred. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when all is said and done, this is all we can ask you to do. Consider the evidence on each side. Consider all of the arguments, one way and the other. Then weigh that evidence, and then decide which model of origins, creation or evolution, do the data fit best. And when you look at that fossil record, if you can look at that fossil record objectively and say, well, I don't care really how we come out on this, I'm going to look at it objectively, I'm going to vote for the side that has the best evidence, you're going to vote for creation. There's no question about it, ladies and gentlemen. You just don't have a choice. Creation wins hands down.
30 seconds.
And when we look at the evidence from the complexity and the evidence for purposefulness and design that we have in this marvelous, wonderful universe that we have on this beautiful earth and the life that each one of us have, again I say, the best explanation that we have for that is by far the only reasonable, rational, scientific explanation is in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth and gave us life. Thank you.
Dr. Weinshank?
Well, my favorite hero, who's Sherlock Holmes, said that, I wish I'd brought the quote with me, something about the solution to the problem is that one has to search for truth in detail. As I said, I'm not a vertebrate paleontologist, but I do remember reading all of my books a long time ago when I was an undergraduate, something about, notochords and fishes and backbones and things like that, and maybe folks would go out and trace those down, and perhaps we could disabuse Dr. Gish of the notion that there's no intermediate between invertebrates and vertebrates. Indeed, the pathway does not go through things like things with exoskeletons and so forth, and I think he knows that. He alleges there's a kind of scientific cabal, a conspiracy. As if all the scientists in the world got together in a closet someplace and decided not to let him publish. Forgive me, the run-in with Discover is, I guess, unfortunate, but that's not what I meant by scientific publication. Discover, which I read all the time, is a fun magazine, but it's not a scientific journal. Scientific journal is one in which, in a very rigorous fashion, you present a theory, the evidence, the methodology, all of the nitty-gritty technical details about how much of this and that you used and what temperature and how long you spun it in the centrifuge and all the other boring things which seem trivial to the layman but are a vital concern to the scientist, because in the very doing of science, in the methodology of how you do the experiment, is the question of whether or not you're doing the experiment well or not. That's the kind of publication I'm talking about. People are not preventing the creationists from publishing in these journals. The creationists simply have, the creationist position is simply not fruitful of new information. I would love to see the creationists publish hard scientific evidence which shows that some small idea in evolution is wrong. I had hoped when I taught the course with John Moore, in fact, to find such evidence, and I spent months in the library tracking down allegations of footprints in stone and just on and on. Footprints in stone is kind of interesting. It's the one genuine piece of research the creationists, almost the only one, that they've ever done. They claimed that human and dinosaur footprints cross in the Paluxy River in Texas. That also turned out to be wrong in the movie that included it called Footprints in Stone, which they showed to hundreds of thousands or millions of people, was finally withdrawn. Partly because when I finally got a hold of the movie to teach it to teach this course in 1976, I took frame by frame and looked at it, and in the bottom of the so-called human footprints, you could see as clearly as anything the imprints of claws. There is at the Paluxy River in Texas, or there was a long time ago, a well-known five-toed dinosaur.
2 minutes.
But the creationists doing this kind of research leaped into saying this is a human footprint. Dr. Gish, I noticed, did not mention that film or that class of evidence tonight, because eventually, in the face of criticism from such places as Loma Linda University, they had to withdraw it. I guess in summary what I'm saying is that science is a very hard taskmaster, and people's reputations are made and broken on the basis of their critical skills in doing scientific research. If the creationists propose that evolution is wrong, they should do what the rest of us do, which is to publish articles in critical refereed journals. The fact that they cannot, the fact that they have to appeal to you rather than confronting the scientific community, convinces me at least that creationism is not a science.
Before we go to our 20 minutes of questions from the audience, we will have a brief 2-minute intermission. 2 minutes.
Well, we don't have, what happened to our mics? I don't know.
We need a little pop up here.
Well, here's the mic. Isn't there another mic over there?
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just before the first intermission comments, in the back of the audience, way back to the back there were several of our professors here on the campus sitting together, discussing the debate among themselves. In discussing the question and answer period, there was an allegation made that since our moderators had this problem, that he would be preferential to giving Dr. Gish easy questions and Dr. Weinshank tough questions. So I gave Dr. Gish one of the professors back there the opportunity to choose out the questions.
Excellent. Excellent
And
idea.
have our moderators choose the questions for Dr. Weinshank. Yes, I'm sure that's fine.
I've already. Well, I've already.
Yeah. Seems like you've done a good job.
Sure, I know Dr. Weinshank
Three
thinks this is
questions. I determined 3 questions, which each of them will respond to. 2 questions with an individual. So
You can just tell them.
You can tell them, if you choose one of those professors to choose the question, that'd be fine with me. Now, what does Dr. Weinshank, what does he prefer? Yes, that's right. So if he said this is okay, then assure them that Dr. Weinshank is at ease about it, I'm at ease about it, and
you got to look at some of these questions. Really biased.
Yeah, it sure has. Yes, I think so. All right.
How are we going to do this? Probably the best thing to do would be to just
what did he get presented? Okay.
No, 2 minutes. 2 minutes to respond to that.
Okay.
It doesn't give you a great deal of time, really, just to touch on an issue.
How are you going to do? Are you going to ask the question and we're going to go in there?
Yeah. Three questions, two were responding. Three common questions, two.
What's that again?
Okay, there are three questions that I'll ask each of you to respond to. And then four questions to respond to.
Yeah. Another question that's directed to me.
Three of them are.
Three of them.
And then there were two questions that you respond to. And two other questions.
Well, after I respond, will he have a chance to respond?
Right, the first three questions. Let's come to order, please, so that we can continue. We want to have our question time from the audience. I thank each of you who gave questions to the ushers. I've tried to sort through those questions to determine questions for each of our debaters to answer. And here's the result of my scanning those questions. Each of the debaters will answer the first three questions that I will ask. And then each of them will respond. There will be four questions. Each of them will respond to two. Excuse me. There will be three questions which each of them will respond to. And then I will ask each of them two questions that they will respond to individually. So the first three questions, each of them will respond to. Correct? Okay, you understand? All right. The first question that our debaters will respond to is this. And it centers around the whole idea of scientific evidences, either for evolution or for science, or excuse me, for creation science. Putting it very simply, what are your best evidences for creation science or evolution? Dr. Gish, and then we'll have Dr. Weinshank respond after him.
Well, there's three areas of the evidence that I generally emphasize in a debate of this kind where we have a complete freewheeling opportunity. The first is the science of thermodynamics, which I did not get into. That just simply tells us that everything in the universe, from the scale of the galaxies down to the level of the molecule, has a natural tendency to go from order to disorder, from complex to simple. The whole universe is running down right now. My statement is then that if the universe, the natural laws governing the universe now are leading to its death and destruction, and if these natural laws are all there is and ever has been, how could those very same natural laws create the universe in the first place? Secondly, the matter of probability, which I did deal with here tonight, which I believe is so compelling. And thirdly, the fossil record, the absence of transitional forms, these big gaps, the huge gaps between the phyla, the classes, and the orders, two of which I emphasize, the gap between single-cell and complex invertebrates, between complex invertebrates and fishes, the fossil record, the real, actual, hard scientific evidence. Those are the three areas that I feel are so compelling for creation.
Dr. Weinshank?
I can't give you a simple answer to a question of that nature. I really wish I could. I'll sketch just a couple of things very briefly. One is all of the phylogenies, that is all the evolutionary trees that we construct, on the basis of the fossils, on the basis of the anatomical evidence, on the basis of the molecular evidence, give us overlapping, but not, and I emphasized it earlier, but not identical pictures of what I call descent with modification. The second thing, I guess, is, and I'm sorry we didn't get into this tonight, the theory of evolution does require an extremely long time frame. And in fact, all of the cosmological and geological evidence that we have supports that. That was a great problem in Darwin's day when we thought the Earth was much younger than it is now. There's a book I didn't even mention by Joe Birchfield called Lord Kelvin and the Age of the Earth. I didn't put it on there because it was getting kind of far afield, but it deals with the history of this controversy about the age of the Earth, and I think that's a very important class of evidence. But I guess as important as any of these is the fact that we recognize today that many of the problems that we saw in the past with the theory of evolution, for example, that we could not see the formation of new species, have in fact been resolved today. We have hundreds of examples of evolution above the species level. We understand in great detail now how it is that organisms speciate into two different species. They go under various terms like allopatric speciation, meaning things that form species in different areas, things like, for instance, and again, we didn't even get into this, the two squirrels at the north and south rim of the Grand Canyon, and sympatric speciation, sympatric coming from a root word meaning common fatherland, if you will, in which organisms that live side by side form different species, and we have that replicated in frogs and insects and lots of other cases.
Dr. Weinshank, I need to interrupt you so that we can move on, please.
That's it. Thank you.
If you would just remain standing so that we can respond to the next question, that will simplify things. I'm going to read the question just as it was received. This seemed to be a common question among several of the ones I got. And it goes like this. It seems that the question, which theory does the evidence support, is only valid if total objectivity were possible on the part of the scientist. The real issues, it seems, are regarding worldview and presuppositions, which ultimately will determine one's understanding of the evidence. Is total objectivity possible? Dr. Weinshank?
No. Shall I say anything else? I mean, did that require more than that? Of course not. In fact, I did two things. I did one thing, I should have done another thing more clearly than I did. I told you there were certain rules of science. Those rules of science are designed, and we've learned over the last, as I said, couple of centuries that violation of those rules leads people into doing very bad science. Those rules of science are adhered to precisely because they keep us from letting our own presuppositions get in the way of doing good science. If I start to invoke one-of-a-kind causes, then I'm in trouble. And other scientists will, for very good reasons, not pay any attention to me. The other half of it has to do with what is my worldview. Yes, worldviews do make a very important difference to the kinds of questions that scientists ask, to the kinds of questions that scientists even consider worthy of asking at a particular time. I'd refer you to yet something else that's not on that list, a famous essay by Tom Kuhn, K-U-H-N, at Harvard, called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. I've sent you out of here with a lot of reading, and I apologize, but it's worth the struggle, believe me. So the upshot is, yes, there are assumptions, and they do make a difference, and worldviews do get in our way, but in short, the nature of the scientific process is designed to be critical enough to prevent us from going very far astray as we do scientific research.
I certainly would endorse much of what Dr. Weinshank has said on this point. However, I want to point out that there are certain areas where our preconceived ideas, our prejudices are so powerful and influence us to a tremendous degree. That is, in any theory, my theory or Dr. Weinshank's theory, we tend not to see the evidence that contradicts our theory, and we tend to give great weight to all the evidence that supports our theory. It is said that a good scientist is a scientist who does not find what he's looking for if it's not there, but he does find what he's not looking for if it is there. But unfortunately, most scientists are like most people. We tend to find what we're looking for. Basically, we have these strong preconceived ideas, and it's certainly true in this subject of origins, and particularly human origins, where the stakes are so high. You can become famous overnight, you see, with some bold claim about some particular fossil. And so the tendency is to really believe it, whether the evidence is there or not. I worked with two Nobel Prize winners, particularly one I know how this man tended to believe something so very strongly because he wanted to believe it, although we produced evidence that was actually contrary to that belief. But there was just enough, on the edge there that he could promote that belief because he wanted to believe it because the Nobel Prize was in the offing. And so, yes, I would agree with Dr. Weinshank. There's certainly not a total objectivity. Nobody has such a thing. And we just, when Dr. Weinshank gets up here, he has preconceived ideas. I do. Ladies and gentlemen, in spite of all these difficulties, you just have to weigh the evidence that we have presented and try to decide which of these two theories, creation or evolution, seems to have most of the evidence.
Dr. Gish, if you would just stay up there, we'll proceed with the next question. Gentleman addressed this question: has the evolutionary establishment ever been able to explain and or fit the data of Robert Gentry's work into the evolutionary worldview? Gentry's work dealing with radio halos and polonium halos.
Yes, would you give me just a few minutes to explain what Robert Gentry's work is all about? He studied halos where you have a kernel or a grain of uranium, and it is shooting out these alpha particles. Depending upon the energy of a particular alpha particle, you go from, say, uranium 238 to 234, 234 to 230, 230 to 226 to 222 to 218, so forth down to lead 206. Each one of those alpha particles has a particular energy. The energy of those alpha particles vary for these various decays, and so they will travel a certain distance in the crystal in which that uranium is embedded. If it's in quartz or something like that, you have that kernel of uranium embedded in there, and these alpha particles go out, and they go out a certain distance. They go out a greater distance, the greater their energy. When they stop, they distort the crystal. So you have concentric rings around that grain of uranium left by these alpha particles. Where they stop, they distort the crystal and leave it, make these halos. So if you have uranium, you'll find all of the rings, halos, for each one of these decay products going right down to lead 206. Dr. Gentry has found halos for polonium-218 with nothing else, no other halos from any of the other decay products of uranium, just the ring for polonium-218.
You have 30 seconds, Dr. Gish.
I'm trying to explain it. Let me, I want to answer your question, but I have to explain what he found. Now, he's maintaining if you have only that one solitary halo, that means you only had polonium-218. But the problem is this: the half-life of polonium-218, I forget, is either measured in minutes or seconds, and you can only get that ring in a solid rock. You can't get it in a molten rock. That means that rock had to form in just minutes to get the halo. That was the significance of his work. Now, I heard him give a talk on this to a group of evolutionists at the AAAS meetings, Association for the Advancement of Science, in Santa Barbara. The reaction of those evolutionists...
Dr. Gish, I must interrupt you so we can continue here, okay?
Well,
all right.
I didn't get to answer the question, but I wanted to explain. Let me just say this. What their reaction was this. Well, Mr. Gentry certainly is a very fine scientist. There's no question he's an excellent scientist. No question he's the expert on these halos. No more about it than anyone else. But eventually we'll be able to explain this within our standard theory. That was their reaction.
Thank you. Dr. Weinshank?
I haven't the faintest idea. I have never read Gentry's paper. I know nothing about this topic, so I would make a suggestion to you. It's not going to be an answer to this question, but a somewhat more general answer to the question of the way the creationists use these data. One of the things that I put in that reading list, which only some of you have, and for which I apologize again, is something you can get, a paper by G. Brent Dalrymple called Radiometric Dating, Geologic Time, and the Age of the Earth, because all academicians use titles with colons in it, a reply to, quotes, scientific creationism. He is with the U.S. Geological Survey, and I have a copy of the paper here. It's just this. It's not terribly expensive. And I've put the address in the reading list. I would suggest that you right away and get a copy of this Dalrymple paper, because it deals very broadly with all of the cases where the creationists claim that radioactive dating is wrong. It's the best I can do. I'm sorry I'm unfamiliar with Gentry's work.
The next two questions, the last two questions of this session, will be addressed to each professor, each debater individually. Dr. Gish, would you please address the issue of macro versus microevolution? What is your perspective of this whole area, microevolution especially?
Yes, microevolution is commonly referred to as the variation within a species, just like a variation in peppered moths or variation of coloration of snails or caterpillars, something like that. That's a minor variation. That's called microevolution, supposedly due to mutations, gene mutations, produce very small effects. The standard neo-Darwinian evolution believes that these very small effects accumulate during vast stretches of time and can cause macroevolution, or big changes. Macroevolution is the origin of the big kinds, the origin of all of those invertebrates from a microscopic organism, the origin of fishes from the invertebrates. That's macroevolution. That's big changes you see. How that happened, that is a great dispute among evolutionists today. These people who believe in slow and gradual evolution believe that slow and gradual evolution accumulated over vast stretches of time will make these changes. There are other evolutionists say, no, it can't do that. And furthermore, we don't have the transitional forms that you must have if that has happened, you see. So the microevolution, just a variation within the species, and that we accept all that. We certainly do believe in that. But extrapolating that, say, the variation in finches, to the idea that finches, canaries, and eagles have arisen from a common ancestor, and birds in turn had arisen from reptiles. There is no evidence for that at all. That's extrapolating evidence for this very limited variation to unlimited change. And that's where we feel that evolution is all wrong.
Dr. Weinshank, would you like to address that whole issue there, or would you prefer to field another question?
No, can I deal with
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Next time we get together, I'm going to bring along some more transparency material. Let me put this back on. Dr. Gish has, without exactly telling you this, implicitly cast his answer in the form of the question by distinguishing between microevolution and macroevolution, as if they were qualitatively different. The easiest way I can represent this is if I have a population of organisms and I have some measure of how they vary within the population. It kind of sort of looks like that. If I were a better artist, it would look more nearly like a bell-shaped curve. Now, as for instance, selection goes on, what happens is that some organisms prove more fit, and again, remember my definition of fitness, and eventually we end up with a new population which looks like that. That is, this population and this population are different in terms of the number of different genes that have arisen by mutation and recombination over the course of time. The argument that evolutionists make is that there's no point at which you can say, stop, you can't go any further. Implicit in Dr. Gish's assumption is that yes, cats can vary, but they can't vary so much that somehow he can no longer recognize them as cats. Implicit in the evolutionist position is there is no barrier. It's not like the medieval maps, of distant oceans where there were signs that said, here there be dragons. At any point, we think, on the basis of all the work that's been done so far, organisms can vary essentially without limit, so that over time, and we've seen it in our own lifetimes, classic studies being, for instance, Spartina grass, which grows in the shallow seawater, over time, new species can arise. Over enough time, new genera can arise, and if you remember the order of things from kingdoms and phylums and so forth, you can figure out the rest of my argument for yourself. There is no barrier to limitation given enough selection, enough time, enough speciation, enough branching. You're not going to see cats evolve into new species in your lifetime, but you can reconstruct the evolution of cats from the fossil record.
Thank you, Dr. Weinshank. Debaters, I will have you each address one more question individually. First for Dr. Gish. The question goes like this. You say you find it hard to believe that the complex universe arose from hydrogen, but is this not comparable to the very complex human body developing from a comparably simple sperm cell?
Totally different. You see, in a fertilized egg, that egg is programmed. It's got an immense amount of genetic information there. The fact is, all of the genetic information is present in that fertilized egg, necessary to produce the adult human. Furthermore, the metabolic machinery is present. That cell can absorb food from the surroundings. It has a metabolic machinery then to digest that food and convert it into its own constituents and to derive energy from it. So it has the machinery, and it has the marching orders, so to speak, the instructions on how to proceed to produce a human. Now, we have foggiest notion how this is done by the cell. It's so incredibly complex, but it does that. Now, no one would suggest for a minute, or I don't know, at least, hydrogen gas is programmed to produce people over billions of years of time. You take hydrogen gas and examine the properties of hydrogen gas. Look at the properties of hydrogen gas and other materials. No scientist has ever recognized any inherent or intrinsic tendency of matter to promote itself from disorder to order, from simple to complex. We don't have a natural law which describes such a property of matter. But we do have a natural law known as the second law of thermodynamics that tells us there is a universal natural tendency for all systems that go in exactly the opposite direction. How then, if that's true, if the natural laws and processes are programmed to destroy and deteriorate and bring things downward? Now, of course, we are living organisms. We have the machinery. We have the genetic information. We can, in spite of the second law of thermodynamics, exist temporarily. Obviously, the second law destroys all of us. We all go to a pile of dust. But the only reason the human species continues because we have the ability to reproduce, because we have that machinery. But that is not because natural matter has that natural tendency. It has the opposite tendency. And so there's total difference between hydrogen gas producing this universe and a fertilized egg cell producing an adult organism.
Thank you again, Dr. Gish. The last question that I would like Dr. Weinshank to address relates very closely to that question. How does evolution explain the laws of physics, specifically the second law of thermodynamics?
Fond as I am of Dr. Gish, I must tell you that in 1976, in that bitter cold debate that we had at Northwestern, I thought we had settled that issue once and for all. Ilya Prigogine, who won the Nobel Prize for his studies of the second law of thermodynamics, tells us very clearly that there's nothing in the second law of thermodynamics that precludes the evolution of life. The second law of thermodynamics says everything tends toward disorder, or everything's going to hell in a handbasket, as somebody once summarized it. However, that statement applies only, I repeat only, to systems that are very close to equilibrium, which means there's not a lot of energy flowing through the system. That's kind of like a teeter-totter that's just about at balance. It's going to come to rest at balance. But a teeter-totter that's tipped like this is going to move. And a system, plant or animal, that's taking energy and processing with it, doing things with the energy, is precisely a system which does not obey the second law of thermodynamics. As I say, I thought we had settled this issue in 1976. And Dr. Gish started off tonight by saying he wasn't going to talk about it, and then he talked about it repeatedly, so I'm glad I had a chance to try to set the record straight. There is nothing in the laws of physics that precludes life. There's nothing in the laws of physics that says life has to occur. The laws of physics merely tell us what's possible, not what will happen. What will happen is or what can happen is a field of chemistry called kinetics.
Dr. Weinshank, I know you gave a final statement or a statement on religious implications of evolution. Would you like to make a final statement addressing that area?
No, I think not. I think I've said everything that I really came prepared to say on that, and I hope that Dr. Gish will speak to that issue as well.
Okay. Dr. Gish?
Yes, I was prepared since it was on the program. I didn't realize till I got here what it would be, so I have pulled out a few quotations. Richard Lewontin is a professor at Harvard University. Now, I want to make clear, I in no way am implying that all evolutionists are atheists or Marxists or anything like that. Now, Richard Lewontin is both. So I want to give this to emphasize that he has impeccably secular views. He's not coming from a creationist point of view or a Christian point of view or any believer point of view. Let me make clear, let me say this again, so you might miss it. Most evolutionists are not atheists. And many have a deep faith in God and so forth. So I want to make this very clear. I don't want anybody going after saying I'm trying to say that. However, this Richard Lewontin does. This is what he says. He says, this was in a book, an anti-creationist book published in 1983 and edited by Laurie Godfrey. He says, this was in his introduction to that book, yet whatever our understanding of the social struggle that gives rise to creationism, whatever the desire to reconcile science and religion may be, there is no escape from the fundamental contradiction between evolution and creationism. They are irreconcilable world views. End of quote. I think that's a very significant statement. They are irreconcilable worldviews, and if they are, if creation is religion, then obviously evolution is religion, because it's a worldview, you see. They're irreconcilable worldviews. Now, a humanist pamphlet published by the Humanist Association says this. The American Humanist Association, the leading atheist organization in the United States, they are by definition atheists. They say humanism is the belief that man shapes his own destiny. It is a constructive philosophy, a non-theistic religion. End of quote. So they say humanism is a non-theistic religion. Then they quote Sir Julian Huxley, who says, I use the word humanist to mean someone who believes that man is just as much a natural phenomenon as an animal or plant, that his body, mind, and soul were not supernaturally created, but are products of evolution. End of quote. Now you see, evolution is the basic dogma of the American Humanist Association, and those who share that particular view. It has deep, tremendously important religious implications. You see, when our young people sitting there in the colleges and universities, most of our classrooms in the schools, not all, but most, they are literally being indoctrinated in evolutionary theory as an established fact. Now, furthermore, evolution is taught as a strictly natural explanation. God, by definition, is excluded from the process because it was a process of self-transformation. God may exist, but he's not necessary, you see, in this process. So we are the products of hydrogen gas in this natural process, you see. And the young person that's sitting and listening to this and not having the opportunity, as you have heard tonight, to hear the scientific evidence for creation, they come away with the idea, well, who needs God? I'm the product of hydrogen gas. If I'm the products of hydrogen gas, my only destiny is a pile of dust. There is no God. There's no one to whom I am responsible. Now, the person teaching that theory may not believe that. He may have a totally different philosophy, but the teaching of that theory is going to have that inevitable effect, predictable effect. And some others have very, very definite views on the teaching of what evolution means. Now, I'm going to quote from an atheist again, G. Richard Bozarth, in his article in American Atheist, September 1978, on page 30, entitled The Meaning of Evolution. And before I quote this article, I want to emphasize the fact that we creation scientists have no quarrel with science. We are creationists because we are scientists. What we have, the quarrel we have, is with those scientists who believe in evolution, that is the theory of evolution, the philosophy of evolution. That's where our quarrel is, not with science itself. But this is what Bozarth says. Christianity has fought, still fights, and will fight science to the desperate end over evolution. Because evolution destroys utterly and finally the very reason Jesus' earthly life was supposedly made necessary. Destroy Adam and Eve and the original sin, and in the rubble you will find the sorry remains of the Son of God. If Jesus was not the Redeemer who died for our sins, and this is what evolution means, then Christianity is nothing. End of quote. Now that's the conviction of this atheist. Now, in closing this, I'm convinced that the theory of evolution and what it means really does have some very deep implications here. And let me emphasize again, there are many evolutionists who are theistic evolutionists. They believe in God. They believe in the Bible. They're the Muslims, Jews, Christians, and they have a deep faith. Most of the people on our staff were evolutionists at one time. But to teach our young people this theory as an established fact and as a naturalistic, mechanistic theory due to properties inherent in matter is going to convince millions of them there's no God, and that they're only responsible to themselves. And I believe what we have seen now, you may applaud it, you may agree with it, you may like it, the changes that have occurred in our society in the past 50 years. But if somebody had told me then that what we've seen happen was going to happen, I wouldn't have believed a word of it. And I tell you, I feel dreadful about what's happened in our society today, the drug culture, and this AIDS plague, and the stuff that we have seen today. I believe is unfortunate. I believe is wrong. And I believe one of the major reasons for that is because our judges, our educators, our scientists, the leaders in our society have been literally indoctrinated in evolutionary philosophy. I'm not going to blame that evolution on everything, not a bit. But I think that's one of the major reasons we have seen these changes. So I am concerned about it, and that's why frankly, that's our motivation. That's why we're concerned about it. And that's why I left the Upjohn Company in 1971, why Dr. Morris left the Virginia Polytechnic Institute, where he was chairman of the Civil Engineering Department, 27 professors under him. We went out there with nothing, with no sales, no income, but because we were concerned about this issue.
Thank you, Dr. Gish. Let's give these two men a round of applause for their participation tonight. That concludes our formal debate session. There will be a 10-minute intermission, and following that intermission, for those of you who desire to stay and continue, there will be an informal opportunity for you to ask questions of our participants tonight. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
for coming.